Welcome to another chilling episode filled with mystery and horror. Today we're diving into one of the creepiest topics: haunted churches in the United States. These sacred places, once symbols of peace and hope, have become home to dark entities and unexplained paranormal events. From shadows lurking in the dim light to bells ringing on their own at night, these true stories show us that sometimes the scariest things aren't what we can see, but what hides in the darkness. Get ready for 3 spine-chilling tales that will make you think twice before stepping into a church after dark.
When I was a teenager, my best friend Tom and I used to explore abandoned places. It was one of those things that made us feel brave, almost invincible. One day, we heard about an abandoned church on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a small town in central Texas. According to local legends, the church had been the scene of a tragedy in the 1950s, but there wasn't much information about it. To us, it sounded like the perfect late-night adventure. We decided to go one summer night around 11 p.m. The road leading to the church was deserted, surrounded by empty fields and twisted trees that cast eerie shadows along the way. When we finally arrived, the church looked like a dark silhouette against the starry sky. It was half collapsed, with broken windows and a leaning bell tower that looked like it could fall at any moment. Armed with flashlights, we pushed through the front door, which barely hung on its hinges. Inside, everything was covered in dust, overturned pews, rusted candelabras. The air was thick and a strange, musty smell lingered. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, we nervously laughed. "It's just an old church," Tom said, trying to shake off the unease we both felt. We ventured deeper, walking down the main aisle toward the altar. That's when I noticed strange symbols painted on the walls, symbols that looked like they'd been added after the church had been abandoned. They weren't crosses or anything religious, more like primitive markings, almost satanic. Something felt off. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked suddenly. I went quiet and listened. There it was, soft, whispering voices like someone praying under their breath. My heart skipped a beat when I realized the sound was coming from near the altar. We moved closer, our flashlights trembling in our hands. At the altar, there was an old Bible opened on a wooden stand. The pages were rustling slightly, as if touched by a breeze, but there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, though we couldn't see anyone. That's when we noticed something that stopped us in our tracks. On the wall behind the altar was an inverted cross, painted in what looked like dried blood. Tom wanted to leave, but I convinced him to stay a little longer. It was creepy, sure, but we didn't want to chicken out. Still, the longer we stayed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Then we started hearing footsteps, like someone walking in the side aisles, but every time we shone our lights, there was nothing there. Suddenly, the door to the confessional slammed shut. The sound echoed through the air, and we both turned toward it. "There's no wind," Tom whispered, his face pale with fear. That was the moment we decided we'd had enough and started backing toward the exit. But just before we reached the door, we heard a deep, guttural voice coming from somewhere in the dark recesses of the church. "You can't leave." We froze. That voice, it wasn't human. It felt like it was vibrating in the air, filling the room with a malevolent energy. I glanced toward the door and saw something move in the shadows. It was a tall figure, cloaked in black, dragging its robes along the floor. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. It wasn't expecting us to leave, it was blocking the exit. We ran. I don't know how we found the courage, but we sprinted down the aisle, dodging the overturned pews and not looking back. The front door was just a few feet away when we heard the church bells. They hadn't rung in decades, but now they were clanging with a terrifying force, as if announcing our doom. As soon as we burst through the doors, the bells stopped and everything fell into a deathly silence. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, gasping for breath, too afraid to even glance back at the church. When we finally drove off, I looked in the rearview mirror and, for just a second, I saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching us leave. From that night on, both of us started having recurring nightmares. In my dreams, I was always back in that church, and the figure in black was waiting for me, each time closer than before. Tom told me he saw it too, but neither of us wanted to talk about it much. We stopped mentioning the church entirely, but whatever we encountered that night seemed to have followed us. A few months ago, I got a call from Tom. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his voice was shaky, disturbed. He said he felt like something was following him and that ever since that night at the church, the shadows in his house moved, like something was waiting. He asked for help, but before I could respond, the line went dead. I went to his house to find him, but he was gone. His parents said he'd vanished without a trace. Sometimes, when I'm walking alone in the dark, I feel like something is watching me, and deep down, I know the Church of Silence still claims me as its own.
A few years ago, I volunteered for a historic church restoration program. One of the strangest assignments I ever had was at a small, abandoned church in Ravens Hollow, a nearly forgotten town deep in Virginia. The church had been closed since the 1970s after a mysterious incident that the locals refused to talk about. But the building, with its broken stained glass and leaning bell tower, needed restoration, and our team was called in to begin the work. From the moment we arrived, the place felt wrong. The church stood in the middle of a dense forest, isolated, with the trees almost pressing in on it as if trying to reclaim it. The leaves crunched under my boots as we approached, and the wind whistled through the broken windows, creating an eerie, almost mournful sound. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust and the musty smell of decay. But what struck me most was the silence, so profound it felt like it was swallowing every sound we made. The first few days were relatively uneventful. We worked on basic repairs, clearing debris and assessing structural damage. But one of my co-workers, Mike, started complaining about feeling watched, especially when he worked near the pulpit. At first, we laughed it off, but soon, several of us began noticing strange things. Every so often, we'd hear faint whispers echoing from the choir loft or the confessional at the back of the nave. But when we checked, there was never anyone there. One day, I was working alone in the nave, cleaning up debris near the altar, when something happened that I'll never forget. I was bent over, sorting through old broken pews, when I heard it, a bell ringing. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but then I realized it was inside the church. My heart stopped. I looked up at the bell tower, and there it was, the rusty old bell, slowly swaying back and forth, giving off a faint metallic sound. The weirdest part? There was no wind. No reason for that bell to move after decades of silence. I felt a chill run down my spine and took a step toward the altar, trying to calm my nerves. That's when I saw it. In the back pews, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was dark, barely visible in the dim light, but I knew it was there. My body froze as I tried to focus my eyes, but every time I blinked, the figure seemed to shift, disappearing and reappearing closer. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Slowly, I backed away, heading toward the door, but my feet felt heavy, like something was trying to keep me there. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, saying words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with an indescribable fear. When I finally broke free and ran outside, I realized I wasn't alone. Mike and another coworker, David, were out there, pale as ghosts. "Did you see it?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "That thing was in the choir loft." David just nodded, staring blankly into the distance. That night, none of us slept. We had all seen something we couldn't explain. The next day, we decided to return one last time to gather our tools and leave for good. But when we arrived, something even more disturbing was waiting for us. Inside the church, right in the center of the altar, were deep scratch marks, like something had clawed at the wood. But the most terrifying part? The pews. Every seat was filled, not with people, but with figures made from branches and leaves, crude imitations of human forms. They had been carefully placed, like a twisted congregation, all facing the pulpit. We left without looking back. No one talked about what we saw afterward, and the project was abandoned shortly after. The church still stands, overgrown and forgotten. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has tried to restore it. And if they did, I hope they ran when they heard the bell.
A few years ago, my friend David and I decided to explore an old abandoned church deep in the woods of Salem, Massachusetts. As urban explorers, we were always on the lookout for places with eerie histories to record for our YouTube channel, and this forgotten church seemed perfect. Built in the 1600s, the church was said to have been cursed during the infamous Salem witch trials. Over the centuries, locals stopped going there, whispering about strange occurrences that drove people away. No one ever stayed after dark. Of course, that only fueled our curiosity. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when we set out. The trees were bare, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The wind howled through the forest as we made our way down the narrow, overgrown path. Eventually, the church came into view. It was ancient, with crumbling stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The windows were shattered, and the roof had partially collapsed. But despite the decay, the bell tower still stood tall, looming ominously over the surrounding trees. We entered the church, our flashlights slicing through the thick darkness. Inside, it smelled of rot and mildew. The wooden pews were rotting, and the altar was covered in dust and debris. There was a weight in the air, something that felt off. Cold. Not just from the weather, but a bone-deep chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. David, always the brave one, started recording immediately. He scanned the room with his camera, narrating our discovery. At first, everything seemed normal, just the eerie silence of a long-abandoned place. But then, the temperature dropped even further, to the point where our breath became visible in the air. That's when we saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But no, this shadow was moving. It stood at the far end of the church, near the altar. It was tall, vaguely human-shaped, but there was something distinctly unnatural about it. David froze, his camera fixed on the figure. "Are you seeing this?" he whispered, barely able to contain his fear. I nodded, unable to speak. The shadow began to glide toward us, slowly, deliberately, without a sound. The closer it came, the colder the air became, as if it was drawing all the heat out of the room. That's when we heard the whispers.
At first, they were soft, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing, but they grew louder, swirling around us. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, malevolent. Whatever was here, it wanted us gone. We need to leave. Now, I said, my voice shaky. But David didn't move. He was still recording, his eyes glued to the shadow that was now just a few feet away from us. And then, something happened that I'll never forget. The bell rang. It wasn't a normal bell sound. It was deep, guttural, like something from the depths of the earth. With each toll, the shadow seemed to grow darker, more defined. And it wasn't alone. More shadows began to emerge from the walls, from the floor, from every dark corner of the church. Human-like figures, faceless but unmistakably watching us, surrounding us. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, angry, screaming. The church itself seemed to be alive with hatred. We ran. We bolted out of the church, the sound of the bell and the screams chasing us into the woods. The cold disappeared as soon as we crossed the threshold, but I could still hear the tolling of the bell in the distance, getting fainter as we ran. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, I turned back for one last look. The shadows were there, staring at us through the broken windows. And in the bell tower, a tall, dark figure stood silhouetted against the gray sky. The bell was still ringing. David and I never uploaded that video. Something told us it would be a mistake. Since that night, both of us have been plagued by nightmares. In my dreams, I hear the tolling of the bell, and I can feel the shadows watching me, waiting for me to return. But I won't. No one should ever go back to that church.